when you're a church that draws people from different places, it's kind of a regional church, what does Shalom look like for a church like that?
Oh, that is the best question, really the hardest question. We struggle with that. We've got probably half our congregation that lives in the Newport Costa Mesa area, and then we've got the other half that is because of how easy it is to drive in LA. It's a really, really hard question. What we try and do is pick for the regional people. What we've tried to do with the Costa Mesa people is really focus in on keeping them local since they are local. So that's the easy part. The harder part is how do you train people who are spread out to do that? And up to this point, what we've done is chosen a regional ministry where they're working at the Village of Hope, which is a long-term center for the homeless and their families. But that's the biggest challenge. How do they become shalom makers when they're more spread out and they're not together? It's a lot harder to see if they're having any impact. The training is kind of the same. You're still training them to be agents of reconciliation in their jobs. It's just harder to do when they're all spread out. That's a reason really for us to begin, and we have explored this, to begin thinking about more church plants in those areas so that they can be missional in those areas.
That's good. Yeah, somebody needs to write that book because nobody knows how to do it.
Yeah.
That's what Jim just said. Nobody that I know knows how to, and that's where what's happening in Anaheim with those mixed use, kind of creating human walkable settlements, which is a great definition of a city. Okay, in loving the city, is loving the city done in small groups and corporate body, and if so, how?
Oh, it's a
large corporate body.
I think there's just different opportunities to love the city. There's something really wonderful about a public forum of worship where people can be invited into it, but there's different things that can happen in a small group. A small group in a neighborhood has a lot easier chance to be contextualized on the ground, the boots on the ground, where they can actually love the neighborhood and serve the neighborhood. But the large church has its ability. I just think it's a different part of the body, and each one has strengths and weaknesses.
What are some vehicles to begin training secret agents when resources are limited?
Well, isn't that our challenge for everything? Yeah. The difficulty is you say we won't do it until we have the resources, or you've got to figure out a way to do it. One of the things you can do is if you don't have the money is begin getting. I keep using lawyers because I think they need the most sanctification. I'm kidding. It's a bad lawyer joke. I love lawyers, and I love politicians too. Our congregation is filled with them, so because of the area that we live in. But take all the say the people who work in hospitals and get them meeting over a book study at their thing and begin thinking about. I always tell my congregation, if you're not reading one book that helps you each year to help you think about your vocation and your calling, you're probably being assimilated. And you can challenge your people, get book lists together for every occupation and find what is it that you can suggest to them to begin reading that will inspire them to think Christianly about education, about the medical profession, about the environment, whatever it is, politics, and get the books into their hands. Ask them to read them, get them into groups, and it doesn't take very little resources to do that. At least you're not having to be there to do all the teaching.
That's good. How would you, where did that, what was that one? Assimilations. What are some common assimilations for Christians?
Well, every study out there says, that says on almost every criteria, we look exactly like the non-believing community. Takes, whether it's sexuality, whether it's how we spend our money, how we vacation, how we use our leisure time, how we entertain ourselves. All of those. There's very little. If there's one problem with the modern church today, it's probably not tribalism as much. It's assimilation.
How would you avoid reducing the practice of the gospel to simply the practice of social justice?
Oh yeah, that's. I think the key is to recognize. If we're doing social justice simply without the motivation and the power that comes from the gospel, we're not going to do it for very long, and we're probably going to burn out anyways. And the key is to continually remind ourselves of what the full gospel is, and continue to remind ourselves of how the gospel introduces us and brings us into the kingdom, and then once we're in the fullness of the kingdom, what our obligations are. I was just preaching on Sunday on Matthew 5:17-20, where Jesus talks about the law and whether he's come to abolish it or to fulfill it, that whole question. And I was using the example of Bonhoeffer's Germany. You look at how is it possible that so many believers were so assimilated into German culture that they had no resources, no outside authority that could help them to stand up to Hitler. And I said to our congregation, look, it's really easy to look down at the German Christians and say, how could you do that? We look back in hindsight and say, wow, you didn't stand with the Jews. What was your problem? But do we have any more resources from the scriptures, from the great tradition, to stand against that kind of assimilation? And I would say no. We may not have assimilated to Hitler, but we've assimilated in so many other ways to our culture, and we don't even realize it. So we can't sit in judgment the Nazi Germany, the Christians in Nazi Germany, when in many ways our people have assimilated just as much. So part of it is, what Bonhoeffer kept bringing people back to is the cost of discipleship. That grace is costly, it's not cheap. It cost the Son of God his life. He suffered and died for us. And once you understand we're saved by costly grace, not by cheap grace, we realize that obedience also is costly and that we're called into that type of obedience. And that balance of always going back and forth between those helps us to not make one of the two mistakes, assimilation or tribalism.
I would add that one thing is to emphasize the definition of the gospel and the implications of the gospel. And so the definition of the gospel is 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus died in our place for our sins. The implications of the gospel then are that we go and spread shalom in our spheres of influence. And so to help your people really... That's the gospel. People need to meet Jesus. They are dead in their sin. Hell is hot. They're in trouble. They need Jesus. Okay, so that's the definition of the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, the response to that. And then the response, once they embrace this costly grace, is they are going to go out organically, right, and spread shalom. What does... this is good. Is pursuing cultural power a replacement for pursuing political power? Is it the new version of that? Or should the church pursue both?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know how many of you have seen James Davidson Hunter's new book, To Change the World. I don't know if anybody's read that, but he explores that. It's a tremendous book that every pastor should read. I don't think so. I think the problem with, everything that we do, what Hunter says is interesting. He talks about leadership, and he says, are we supposed to seek power or be servants? And that's an interesting question. But he said, ultimately, all of us are leaders because all of us can have influence on others. And anytime you have influence on someone else, you're exercising a certain amount of power. So you can't say that to seek cultural, to do things in the cultural realm is without power. But the difference is that we're not seeking it for power for its own sake, but we're seeking to influence it in a certain way towards shalom and peace, reconciliation. We're to be ambassadors. And yes, is there an authority there? Yeah, because we're having influence over people, but the definition is different. Now, you look at what so often happens in the Christian world where we lift up celebrity pastors, for instance, and we lift up kind of that. If we're seeking that kind of cultural power, then I don't think it's much different. But if our goal is ultimately shalom, the influence of shalom out there, and we're serving, it's a lot different than just power.